Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Tracy Glab, Curator of Collections and Exhibitions at the Flint Institute of Arts. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual presentation by Eric Birkle, guest curator of the Political and Personal Images of Gay Identity exhibition. This exhibition features 24 works donated by Flint native Jack B. Pearson. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And it is on view. I'm Tracy Glab, Curator of Collections and Exhibitions at the Flint Institute of Arts. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual presentation. Sorry, I didn't mute my other computer. All right, let's start over. This exhibition features 24 works on paper donated by Flint native Jack P. Pearson and is on view in our graphics gallery through July 11th. Political and Personal draws on Pearson's experience as a gay man, shedding light on the important role sexual identity played in informing his collecting habits. Both the exhibition and this lecture was generously supported and sponsored by the IFPDA, the International Fine Print Dealers Association, and we are extremely grateful for their support. Please visit flintarts.org/lectures to find more information on upcoming lectures sponsored by the Sheppy Dog Fund, as well as recorded presentations of previous lectures. A quick word about this virtual program before I introduce the speaker. Though we are airing this via Zoom, audience members are muted and your cameras are turned off. If you would like to submit a question, please do so via the Q&A button or chat at the bottom of your Zoom window. We are also broadcasting live via YouTube, and you can enter your questions there as well. The Q&A portion of the program will be immediately following the lecture. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce you to tonight's speaker. Eric Birkle hails from Lapeer, Michigan, and is currently pursuing his Ph.D. in art history, visual culture, and curatorial practice at York University in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. He obtained a BA in French and Art from Saginaw Valley State University in 2015, and an MA in Art History and Museum Studies from Ohio University in 2019. From 2014 to 2017, he held several positions at the Saginaw Art Museum, culminating with the role of Associate Curator. Birkle curated this exhibition in the summer of 2018 as part of a Curatorial Internship Program grant awarded to the FIA, also by the IFPDA Foundation. I now turn Men Laid Bare, Homosexual Bodies and Homophobic History over to Eric Birkle. Thank you, Eric, for being here with us tonight. So I'm going to ask you to unmute and start your camera.
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much, Tracy, for the introduction. I'm super excited to be here. And as Tracy said, this exhibition is sort of the product of work that I did while an intern at the FIA with the sponsorship of the IFPDA Foundation in the summer of 2018. So it's really rewarding for me to see the exhibit sort of up and on the walls and to have been invited to give this lecture tonight. So if you've taken a look at the FIA's webpage, you'll have seen sort of a quick description about the talk. But essentially the title Men Laid Bare has to do with this sort of double entendre of literally the sort of bare an exposed body, but also sort of revealing some of these hidden histories that relate to specifically gay identity. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now with all of you so that you can see the presentation. And we'll go ahead and get started. So this first piece I chose sort of to just headline this presentation because I personally liked it, but also because it's by Guatemalan American artist Gio Black Peter, and sort of the colorful image I think conveys a sense of pride, right? And we're in the midst of June and it's Pride Month, and sort of confidence in one's identity. Peter is an out gay man, an artist, and it also harkens back to sort of traditional Guatemalan art that often incorporates sort of vivid colors, sort of like you see here. We also sort of have the laurel crown, which conveys this sort of kingly sort of sensibility to the figure. And I thought it was just a great way anyway to sort of start this off without just sort of displaying, let's say a pride flag or something a little more stereotypical. But just to give you an idea of how I organized this presentation, so the FIA exhibition has a number of works in it, and you'll see some of those throughout the presentation, but not all of them, because I've used them to open up a dialogue about sort of trends that we see in the history of gay art. And you'll also notice that the title is Homosexual Bodies and Homophobic History, and not necessarily Queer Bodies and Queer History. And that is not to be exclusive of identities other than those relating specifically to gay men. However, the exhibition itself does focus on the experience of gay men, because the collection sort of was built around Jack B. Pearson's own identity. And when collecting, it's sort of common practice that collectors will amass objects, that relate to them. And that sounds sort of simplistic, but there is a truth to that. And especially in the 20th century, as he was progressing through his life, especially in the earlier years when it was difficult to be an out gay man, let's say in Flint, Michigan, where he's from, there's some level of comfort that we see in surrounding oneself with this validation through images that sort of depict individuals like himself. So in this presentation, I'm going to be using some words, some terminology. You'll hear homosocial, homoerotic, and homosexual. And these are very similar terms, but they're also distinct. So I've provided a bit of a diagram here to hopefully help you visualize how those are all interrelated and yet also separate. And the broadest one being homosocial, which simply refers to a group of individuals, whether men or women, or those who identify as non-binary, congregating and existing together. And so it doesn't necessarily imply something that's erotic or explicitly gay or queer, but it might. Then we move on to homoerotic, which sort of images that suggest an attraction, an erotic component that is same-sex related. And then homosexual, which specifically is in this expression of someone who identifies as gay or lesbian in this context. So before I show you the first image I want to discuss in more detail tonight, I'd like to note that as with this first image here, you'll see this format where in the lower left-hand corner for each image, you'll see the artist's name, their nationality, as well as their life dates. If they're still living, you'll see, as with Geo Black-Peter here, they're born in 1979 date. You'll also see the title in italics in bold. You'll see the medium, and you'll see the year. Sometimes at the bottom of that, you'll also see a credit line that mentions where this particular work is housed, where it lives, what collection it's in. And for those that are in particular noted as being within the collection of the Flint Institute of Arts, I just want to clarify that all of those have been given to the FIA by Jack B. Pearson himself between the years, between the two decades really, of the mid-1970s to mid-1990s. And if you're at the exhibition in person, you'll see that information. So before we get to one of the works that was donated by Pearson, I want to take a look at this one by Joseph Christian Leyendecker, who was a German-American artist who passed away in the mid-20th century. He's an artist whose work I think is a little bit lesser known than some, and that brings me to the point that I want to make as I go through this presentation. For those of you especially who may be somewhat familiar with the topic or somewhat familiar with gay artists and gay history, especially of the 20th century, you might notice that there are some really big name individuals whose work is maybe lacking, such as George Quaintance, such as Charles Demuth, Keith Haring, even Thomas Eakins. And This is because I wanted to examine the work of some artists who've received significantly less attention than those who've routinely had exhibitions focused on them, publications focused on them. And because the work that I'll show tonight expresses some similar sensibilities, and you'll see some similar styles as well. So I think the message is still being relayed. And it's also a bit of my passion to, again, to unearth some material that's otherwise been sort of, not illuminated as much as it could have been, which was one of the great things about working with the collection at the FIA, as this is the first time it's being showcased, at least in this way. So this piece is called Thanksgiving, 1628 to 1928, 300 years. So this is relevant specifically to American culture, the holiday in late November that we all, or that many of us, I should say, celebrate. And as you can see here, on the left-hand side, you have a pilgrim, specifically a Puritan individual, and representing the year 1628. And on the right-hand side, you have the sort of modern man at that time. It's interesting that this image is almost 100 years old again already. But this individual is clearly, as displayed by the football at his feet, an athlete, a football player, and he's wearing modern garments that are sort of in contrast with this Puritan individuals. I think it becomes fairly evident taking a look at this, with the two men and the way that they're gazing at each other, that there's some sort of tension there, maybe even sexual tension, we might say. And yet Leyendecker is distinguishing these two individuals as different parts of history. For the individual on the left, this is coming from a time when specifically homosexual men and even homosexual women were oftentimes put to death as they were considered to be heretics and existing and living their life contrary to the teachings of the church. And so this sort of way of thinking that's related to Christian tradition, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, comes to the New World, to what becomes the United States of America from England as sort of this reform process, and taking a look into issues that were had by the Puritans with both the Catholic Church and the Church of England. So there's sort of this negative connotation for Leyendecker, who happens to have been a gay man himself, for this individual on the left. For the man on the right, it's sort of this expression of a bit more of a liberal time, a bit more freedom and sexual expression. I say that with some level of caution because, of course, if we compare that time to today, it's really quite apparent that there was much less a freedom for gay men to be out and to be themselves than we would say that we have now. However, if we compare that to 1628, within this continuum, we do see a slightly more open sort of society. So Leyendecker created images like this for magazine covers. This happens to be a lithograph. And we see, that his right pectoral is sort of exposed, and his nipples exposed. The clothing is sort of conveniently pulled from his body. And if you'll notice, I think, going through this presentation, that sort of trope is repeated in by multiple artists in their work. This image by Clinton Brown, who was also a gay artist, was also a magazine cover, actually a little bit earlier than the one we just took a look at, from 1913. You can see here it says "Manhood's Greatest Shield, a strong mind in a strong body." And this magazine began its publication, I believe, in 1899. And it's indicative of a culture that was sort of brewing at the time. And this applies to the Leyendecker image we just looked at as well, which is this renewed interest in athleticism and therefore in the male body and its physical fitness. This comes out of the Olympics, the modern Olympics, which were inaugurated in 1896, which of course were a revival of the ancient Olympics in ancient Greece, in which men only, actually free men specifically, were allowed to participate. So it's very much a male-dominated event. Of course, fast forward to 2021, and females are very much an important, just as much of an important part of the Olympics. But at the time, the focus was really on men specifically, and this was this was contrary to the Victorian period and prior to that in the 19th century, which especially when the nude body or semi-nude bodies were depicted, we would see oftentimes the female nude, as it was considered academically appropriate, and specifically oftentimes related to mythology and these sort of fantastical moments of depictions of historic events. Here we have, the modern man, and there's sort of this directness with which this is conveyed. It's not placed into this context of history necessarily, or of all of these potentially distracting surroundings. It's sort of thrust, literally into our hands, as you can imagine, holding this magazine. And this is something that picked up in the US going into the mid 20th century. You had these physique and beefcake magazines that were published specifically, although their purpose was not explicitly stated. They were essentially published for gay men, and by gay men often, under the guise of sort of, this physical culture of focusing on building up this strong body through exercise, weightlifting, eating regimens and these things. And essentially, if you walk down the magazine aisle today, you'll see we still have a component of this that has carried on. And so it's important to take a look at this moment in the history of art, because we see how the idea of the body evolved from this way of thinking to really inform how we think about the body now, and therefore how some of the artists in the exhibition on view have depicted the body as well. So we fast forward actually a number of decades to 1983. This image here you'll see is by Robert Maplethorpe, who was a gay artist who's very well known. I'm sure a number of you watching right now are familiar with Maplethorpe's work. So he has received a lot of attention. And if you are familiar with Maplethorpe's work, you'll know that this image is really sort of tame. It's really much less explicit than many of the artist's images. I should note another point as we go through the presentation here. Selections for works sort of do teeter toward a full frontal nudity, because we are on this virtual platform, and one of the things that we discuss is wanting to make sure that we don't run into any issues with that. So if you're wondering about some of the selections and why some of those more blunt or direct works were not selected, that does factor into it versus this presentation being able to be in person. So at any rate, here with Maplethorpe, we have captured in the image, the model is Dennis Speight, and he sort of got his arms folded and he has this standoffish sort of look. But what's being captured here is this really hardened physique. Again, this is several decades after the image that we just took a look at here. So Maplethorpe oftentimes, did have relationships with his models. Speight was one of his favorite models. But there's also some controversy surrounding Maplethorpe, despite his sort of projecting gay issues into the limelight in a way through his work and through his career. He was also sort of ambivalent about racial equality and equity. And so there has been some sort of condemning literature that was written about Maplethorpe, especially when you're taking a look at the number of his images in his oeuvre that are specifically of Black men. Never in the sense that he's maybe sort of objectifying them. So that's an ongoing conversation, but nevertheless, it wasn't a really common feature in Maplethorpe's work to feature the male body in this way. Continuing with this theme of the sort of hardened physique, is specifically this, I suppose we could call it a sub-theme of what's called la lutte, which in French means basically the fight, the battle. And so here we see Harry Sternberg's work, and this one is on view in the exhibition. It's called Wrestlers No. 2. So in the early 20th century, you'll see a number of images of wrestlers as this sort of gained popularity and was a way to conveniently exhibit the body. But it's interesting here that the identities of the two men are essentially sort of construed. We see the bodies, we see the limbs, but we don't really have the faces and the identity. So the focus becomes not so much on the individual as in this action, in this sort of heated moment. And there are a number of works that depict this as well. So this is a really fantastic example, again, that's on view at the FIA. And you'll see that it comes from actually a tradition of two men sort of in this heroic struggle, if you will. Here we have a Roman sculpture, which compositionally is not so dissimilar from the work that we just took a look at. And Hercules is sort of the one that's standing on the ground with 2 feet planted on the ground. And what he's doing actually is fighting this individual whose name is Antaeus. He's the one that's lifted up higher. So the classical myth of the 11th labor of Hercules basically tells of the hero Hercules being stopped by Antaeus, who is the son of the sea god, also known as Poseidon, on his way to retrieve the golden apples. But Hercules ultimately defeated Antaeus in a wrestling match, lifting him off the ground and basically crushing him. Nevertheless, we do see a sort of homoerotic sensibility to this work. And I think the same can be said of some of the works that have this sort of similar composition throughout history and including the ones that you'll see in Flint right now. So this tradition comes from as early as the late 2nd century CE, at least within its representation in the visual arts in a material fashion. And if we fast forward quite a bit, still about 170 years before our time, but relatively much more contemporary, we have this image by the French artist Bouguereau, who some of you may know from visiting museums like the DIA that have some really massive canvases of Bouguereau on display in the sort of the impressionistic, near the impressionistic section, I should say. And his later work becomes much softer in its subject matter. But here we have depicted Dante and Virgil. And I particularly like this composition because of the positioning of the figures, which is just so seemingly uncomfortable and somewhat unrealistic, especially to hold it for any amount of time. So if you're familiar, or if you're not familiar, I should say, with this story, what we're looking at is basically a visualization of a moment in the book by Dante, which was published in 1320, from one of the 3 books within the Divine Comedy. Those 3 books are the Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. So basically hell, purgatory, and paradise. So this image comes from the hell section. And at the back left of the image, we see the author, Dante, being guided through hell by his guide, Virgil, who happened to be an ancient poet himself. And so, an ancient Roman poet specifically. So what we see in the foreground are 2 damned souls. And of course, these happen to be 2 naked muscular men in this, again, this fighting position in la lutte. So the man on our left is sort of biting the neck of the man on the right. And the story goes that, they're in this eternal fight, this eternal combat, because they were essentially heretics and fraudsters in their lifetime. But interestingly, people who've been defined as heretics, especially in the past, fall, as I sort of actually mentioned, I think with that first image, thinking about these Puritanistic histories, especially in the US, as, homosexuals specifically. Given the very homoerotic nature of this work, it's not surprising when we compare the story to that. And even though it's rare that you'll find a write-up that will directly address this relationship, it's certainly one that's there. And it's been picked up on much more contemporaneously by those who, the internet is sort of a great thing for propagating visuals. And so we see here on the right, what I've compared is a performance, a reenactment in a sense, by two TikTok/Instagram personas. That happens to be Nikki Champa and Pierre Crespo, who are themselves a couple, and they have individual and joint accounts. So you can see here I've taken a screenshot of this moment where they're attempting to recreate what's going on in the Birkle painting. So it really rings true, even for those who may not necessarily be specialists in the arts, but those who are, again, looking at artwork and seeing their identities reflected therein in the way that Pearson would have as well. So in addition to this idea of the male bodies fighting and combat and this heroic struggle, or even this athletic sensibility that we've taken a look at so far, all of those informing the way that the body has been looked at and conceived in the 20th and into the 21st century. In addition to that, we have the notion or the trope of the bathers. And so here we see two examples of that. One on the left by Ethel Walker, where we have a group of specifically female bodies, and on the right by another French artist, Georges Paul Leroux, where we have a group of male bodies, and in engaging with nature, if you will, in a similar way. So this goes back to, as I mentioned, this renewed interest in the Olympics and this classical revival. This work here that you can see was done at the beginning of the 20th century, 1920 and 1909 respectively. This also is coming out of that tradition of an interest in this ancient world and the life that these individuals lived, or at least may have lived, in the way that the artist imagined it. So there's a particularly ritualistic experience of bathing one's body in the water, and there's the aspect of this search for cleanliness and health, and we see that here, but it's taken a bit farther. And we see this group of men who are looking up at the central figure on the right, who looks as if he's maybe attempting to dive in as one of his counterparts climbs up. And it's not too hard to sort of notice what they're all looking at via the lines of sight that happens to be hidden from view here. So this is a moment of homosocial congregation, and in these moments of bathing, we see this quite frequently, especially as we think of the sort of strict gender roles that were allocated to men and women in the ancient world, and how much time was spent with one's fellow man or one's fellow woman. So on the left, the Ethel Walker painting, specifically, that you can see the title here, it says Decoration, the Excursion of Nausicaa. It relates to the female character in the Odyssey, whose name is such, who bathed with her maidens. And for Ethel, who happened to be a lesbian artist who actually lived and had a relationship with another painter named Clara Christian, this image was sort of a utopian all-female community. And similarly, slash by contrast, if you will, For Leroux, on the right, we have this sort of gay moment that for him provides a utopian vision as well. But in this case, it's all male. And with his work in particular, there's also a direct classical reference with the name of the Tiber in the title, since it does relate to the river that runs through both modern and ancient Rome, the Tiber River. So, and finally, with these sort of various trends that sort of, if you will, got us going with gay art in the 20th century, we have the reclining nude. And yet again, this is one that goes back for practically time immemorial in visual arts in the Western world. So this particular piece is on view in the exhibit. It's by George Bellows. So I think that so far, other than the Sternberg piece, this is the second artist who did not identify as gay or homosexual or queer in some way so far. But nevertheless, Bellows was familiar with this tradition of depicting the nude body in this reclining position. So it's something that runs deep in the history of art, and the reason for that being that, you know, it's this really, it really sort of places on display the way that the artist, or the skill of the artist, and how well they're able to sort of study and communicate the human form, you know, through direct observation, but it also allows them to demonstrate how they can capture subtle aspects of one's personality or status. So even though the female reclining nude is something that's been arguably more prevalent over the course of time, the male reclining nude did see, I guess, a resurgence, we might say, in the 19th century, and also a number of depictions in the 15th century during the Renaissance. Something that might come to mind for those of you that are familiar with some really big name Renaissance art is the Michelangelo's creation of Adam. We see Adam on the ground. He's reaching up as God, you know, begins to sort of touch his finger. So we do have Adam in that position. Similarly to this individual here, George Bellows, like Sternberg, often, you know, depicted wrestlers and men in this sort of combative mode. But here it's a bit more calm and a bit more sensual. As I said, this goes back for many years. In this image, we're seeing Hermaphroditos, which translates in English to the sleeping hermaphrodite. And of course, that is a word that a lot of us will probably balk at because it's not something that's particularly seen as friendly or nice to say. Much more preferable is to describe this individual as an intersex person. Nevertheless, this is the original title. So this is a Roman example, once again, from the first couple of centuries CE. By the way, if you're seeing CE and wondering what that means, it's the equivalent of AD. It's often used in museums to sort of be religion neutral. It stands for Common Era. So that's the era that we are in, as opposed to BCE, or before Common Era. But at any rate, we see this individual whose head is turned away. They are sleeping, and it's from this front view, at least, pretty obvious that this individual has the physical, body parts of both a man and a woman. And what's interesting about this is, as though, even though many of us have probably heard that, in ancient Rome and Greece, gay identity was something that was accepted or even celebrated, at least in some version. It's unfortunately true that the birth of an intersex person was considered to be a bad omen. And so these individuals were often killed. And so it is quite a rare thing to see this depiction in material form in art. And so there's almost, in a way, a bit of a malicious intent here, if I can say that, by the artist, because it's sort of designed to be approached from the back. And from the back side, you really wouldn't be able to tell the gender, the sex of this individual. And so it's designed to be appealing to everyone, and yet, in its context, in its time, also repulsive. So I think this is a great way to talk about the history of the reclining nude, but also of these issues and these certainly the lack of I guess we might say consistency in acceptance in certain ancient societies. Moving along with this reclining nude theme, this is a painting that I really love. I feel like I've been saying that about all of these pieces, but of course I'm very passionate about it, so I do like the pieces that I'm showing you. But I think this image is pretty great because not only do we see the painting, but it's taken from a few feet back, so we see viewers in the museum actually standing in front of it and looking at this work. So this is a painting by Kehinde Wiley, who is an American artist, specifically a Black American artist whose work captures the bodies of Black and brown men, and he positions them in positions of power and positions of reverence that in the tradition of Western art was often reserved for, mostly reserved for just white men, maybe white women. So it's a commentary on how his work is a commentary on how rare it is to see work like this. And so he's kind of filling a void. And interestingly, just like the Hermaphrodite that we took a look at a second ago, this individual is reportedly asleep. That's literally the title of the work. So we have this almost loincloth that's wrapped around his midsection, and the background sort of begins to sort of infiltrate the foreground. So depth is in question here. And really what this symbolizes is, the interaction of the past with the present. So he conflates space, which is a compositional tool, in order to do this. But the background very much has the connotation of perhaps a Renaissance tapestry. So in this individual wrapped in the way that you might see a Christian saint in, let's say, Baroque art. Moving along, another work by Wiley you see here on the left is called A Dogon Couple. And I've juxtaposed it right here with essentially his inspirational source material, which is a piece called Seated Couple by the Dogon peoples, which is a culture that is essentially existed in what is present day Mali in southeastern Africa. And this particular example comes from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, but it's not the only example of a sculpture like this. It was somewhat common to see depictions of a couple, and with the original Dogon piece on the right, what we're looking at is that the figure on the left is the male, and the figure on the left is the female. I know it might be a little difficult for some people to tell, but if you take a look at the hair, that's a primary signifier. So there is a challenging here by Wiley. This piece was painted in 2008, by the way. So a little over 10 years ago. So there's a challenging here of what's considered to be somewhat traditional gender roles. And this idea that the male and the female together bring the two qualities that are necessary to sustain life. So it was fairly rare across the continent of Africa, not only with the Dogon culture, to see physical representations of homosexuality, at least in the way that we might perceive it now as Americans in the West. However, that's not to say that homosexual relationships did not exist in present-day Mali or across the African continent. But they often looked different and were sort of termed differently than what we might be used to now. There's this whole tradition of individuals who exhibit more characteristics of the opposite sex and therefore, become grouped with them. So you have the tradition of boy wives, or you have the tradition of female husbands, in which case, you have physically two men together and two women together, but they're viewed as differently from their physical or outward appearance. So there's a lot that could be said about that, and it merits an entire presentation, I think, on its own. But I did want to give a little bit of background about this important piece and about what Wiley is doing here. So you can see the hand gesture gestures of both of the men are mimicking this original. And so where there was traditionally a female individual, we have yet another male here. And so I think it's just a really powerful piece in that way. Similarly, we have couples depicted by Chinese German artist muskming, who actually now lives in Germany, and where much of his work is exhibited, as well as in the Netherlands, and a bit less so in China. However, his inspiration is the Chinese male body, and specifically, the homosexual relationship between two of them. So it's sort of an interesting thing, because within present day China, there's a bit of an ambivalence about, at best, I would say, about LGBT issues, and there is a lack of protections at the federal government level. And what we see here is, an artist who's trying to sort of spread a sort of imagery that also, especially in the contemporary period, is somewhat sadly rare, which is two Chinese men in love. So that's specifically conveyed in the titles here. On the left, we have Chamber of Love. On the right, we have Warriors in Love. In the piece on the left, we see one of the men is holding a peony, which in traditional Chinese culture is a symbolic for friendship. And yet, given the title and given the physical closeness of these two, it's safe to imagine that this is a bit more than just a friendship. And on the right, the sort of traditional garments of Chinese warriors and those who would be often military are worn by these individuals here, although these are sort of the celebratory versions. And the artist is using it to sort of reclaim the meaning, to apply it to gay couples, to indicate that this is a moment to be celebrated rather than fought against. Also, I should mention another component of the peony in the work on the left is a symbolism. It's also considered to be a symbolism of femininity in Chinese culture. So there is this idea of gay men embracing this feminine side of themselves and being willing to be together in that sense. Okay, so that brings us to Paul Cadmus. And I should point out, what I wanted to sort of say is, once again, here on the right, as we saw at the very beginning of the presentation with Leyendecker, we have this, this fabric that is sort of loose and falling down, and therefore it does cover the genitalia of one of the men, but then reveals the backside of the other, just as Leyendecker's football player sort of had the cloth falling down from his pectoral. We also see this conveniently shredded clothing in the Cadmus piece here, which is, again, one of the works that's on view at the FIA. It's a really powerful image. You have a male nude, essentially, a reclining male nude in the background, or I should say the individual who is behind the one at the very front. And with Cadmus's work, we often see a bit more of an explicit reference to the homosexuality of the figures. So this piece sort of suggests a recent sexual encounter. The muscled bodies are on display yet again. We get a hint of this theme of being by the beach and this connection to this history of the bathers that we've looked at in a couple examples so far. But this was considered as highly radical in 1938. And interestingly enough, this was created in the same year that collector Jack B. Pearson, who was then in his 20s, met his lifelong partner, Robert Martin Purcell, while they happened to be walking in downtown Flint near a place called Wilson Park, which was just one of a number of the city's covert homosexual rendezvous points. So with this work, we're sort of starting to see a move from what I would say is a covert or a coded like insertion of homosexual desire or homoerotic imagery into topics that were considered acceptable, and beginning to move toward a more overt or explicit representation of those two things. Here, similarly and compositionally, we have an Albrecht Dürer. This is substantially older than the Cadmus piece. This is called The Men's Bathhouse. It is a woodcut on paper, also from the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So here we have this homosocial congregation being depicted. And at first, it maybe seems somewhat innocent, but if we take a look at the individual on the left here, who's leaning against this wooden post, we see that he if you look at his face, he seems to be sort of longing or having some sort of daydreaming desire going on. And it's not so difficult to imagine what that might be, given that if we sort of cast our eyes down a little bit, we see this water spigot that is projecting from this wooden beam right in front of the man's genitalia, which bears a striking resemblance, and that's not by coincidence. So again, we have this bathing theme. This happens to be an object from the Renaissance, but now we've sort of seen that across time in a lot of ways. I did want to bring in, even though this presentation does focus necessarily on male homosexuality, I wanted to bring in another example of how we see female homosocial settings being depicted to add to this dialogue a bit. So here we have Jean-Honoré Fragonard, who was a French artist during the Rococo era, which was particularly associated with its softness and its femininity. And these sorts of things. So it's fairly fitting that we see here a congregation or a group of women, and they happen to be located in the dormitory. So these are servant girls, as you can see by the title. And we can imagine that this is after a long day's work, they're sort of socializing. And on one hand, we might think of this as a fantasy by a straight male artist who, maybe wasn't privy to actually entering these sorts of spaces, but imagined this lesbian interaction going on in there. However, it also is, a great representation of the lack of the need for a male counterpart for women to be able to entertain themselves and possibly to even have sexual gratification. Then we have this example by Simon Solomon, who was a gay artist who was out, but really struggled with that in the time that he was alive. You can see which was the latter half of the 19th century. This image, we have essentially what might be understood to be a bisexual situation going on. So it's called The Bride, Bridegroom, and Sad Love. So the bride is, of course, the one female character or figure that we have on the right. The bridegroom is the central male figure, the one who's getting married. And then Sad Love is the male character that's on the left, who very clearly has this downtrodden, sad face. So this work was inspired by a passage from the Gospel of St. John, which tells how, quote, the friend of the bridegroom rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. So the friend is this male counterpart here, who rejoices greatly at this other man's voice whenever he speaks to him. So the friend here is the individual, again, with the sad expression, with the wings that are sort of symbolic of this love. You can almost think of it as a really elongated heart shape in a way. But what this conveys essentially is the central character's expectation or societal requirement to give up this homosexual relationship considered to never be fulfilling for a more meaningful, literally reproductive life with a woman. Interestingly enough, the olive branch that's being held by sad love symbolizes peace, harmony, and hope, which for him here have been broken. So kind of a depressing piece, but really beautiful as well. Then we move on to David Hockney, another sort of sad, downcast image here with Gregory thinking of Henry. This piece is on view in the FIA exhibition. It's got a lot of attention because Hockney is one of those 20th century artists who's very much out and proud. His work depicts issues of gay love and attraction and also struggles. So we see that here. So this depicts Hockney's close companion and sometimes his lover, whose name is Gregory Evans. That's the Gregory that's sitting here. And then what's happening is that Gregory is sort of ruminating on his relationship with yet another man, the third individual, named Henry Geltzoller. So, who was also a mutual friend and lover of Hockney. So we can almost imagine this gay love triangle going on between the artist and the figure that we see, and then the figure that we do not see. So this sense of longing is really amplified by this empty space, the void that's surrounding the figure. The emptiness, on the outside is reflecting that emptiness on the inside. And this sentiment is one that our collector, Jack B. Pearson, would surely have shared, given that his partner, Robert Martin Purcell, actually passed away 1 year prior to the creation of this print in 1976. So this was created in 1977. So we have here a very certain connection between the artist's the collector's lived experience and the work depicted by the artist. You can also see, though, that shortly thereafter, in a lot of ways, in 1980, it was donated to the FIA. So he parted with it only a few years after acquiring it and after it was created. This image I brought in just to sort of convey a somewhat updated or convey an update on Hockney's career and also make the connection to a somewhat contemporary gay figure. So this is David Hockney's painting, or rather drawing, if you will, on canvas of Olympic swimmer Tom Daley, British Olympic swimmer Tom Daley. And this is located at the Los Angeles Museum of Art. I'm not sure if it's currently on display, but this was at an opening that was revealing it in 2017, so about 4 years ago now. That brings us to this work by minisetron, which is one of my favorites in the entire exhibition at the FIA. So again, this is on view. This piece is simply referred to as nude, and here we have a man who's mostly nude, sort of turning away from us, the viewer, leaning against the stool. He's cast aside his dress shoes and presumably his dress clothing, only to be seated in this jock strap. And interestingly here, we have one of the few female artists that's represented in the exhibition. And so it's interesting to think about the relationship between the artist and the sitter or the model here. The face is hidden away, which is sometimes simply an artistic or creative choice, but it can also symbolize that the individual was not comfortable with their identity being revealed to the greater public, especially in a situation so intimate as this one. And also especially when we consider that the garment of the jockstrap itself was invented in 1874 for bicycle jockeys, so literally professional bikers, for comfort and sort of keeping things where they should be. This is a garment that becomes something that's seen as an object of attraction in the gay male community going into the 20th century. And we see it come up time and time again. So here again, we have sort of covert bridging on overt expression of this relationship here. The question is, what is the sitter's identity? Might he be homosexual? Maybe not. Maybe he's just really comfortable with his body. What about his relationship to the female painter or drawer, rather? Is this what we might call today the stereotype of, the girl and the gay best friend? That's a little bit to be determined in some ways, but I think the ambiguity is actually what makes this most interesting. Much less ambiguous is this piece by Louis Fratino, who is an American artist who is really prolific, especially in recent years. You can see this was from 2019, just 2 years ago. This is oil on canvas. So his work is sort of semi-abstracted, but in a lot of ways also very representational. The point being that here we see this fascination continued with this particular garment, with the jockstrap. And, fast forward to today's day and age and the greater level of acceptance, not only in the art world, but in society at large in the US, for gay identity and even gay sexuality. This piece is able to be displayed, whereas even some of these other works that we've looked at so far in their time were either censored or not allowed to be placed on view. So there's sort of a huge turnaround here, and we can quite clearly understand what's going on through the work's title, which is Invitation. Somewhat similar, although actually a little bit more delicate in its approach, is this work by Fabian Caires. If my partner is watching, hopefully I pronounced that correctly. But this is a work by a Mexican artist who has come into the limelight, especially in 2019, with his work, a painting of Emilio Zapata, who was a leading figure in the Mexican Revolution at the beginning of the 20th century. He depicted this individual as queer, very sort of feminized and sitting on top of a horse who is galloping away, if I'm not mistaken, with like high heels on as he does it, right, and even makeup. So there was a huge controversy as that was exhibited at the Palace, the Mexico City Palace of Fine Arts in 2019. And similarly, he sort of attacks what we might call the machismo, hyper masculine culture and history of Mexico through this particular work, where we have flower petals that are sort of raining down, and he's wearing the lucha libre mask, or the mask of Mexican wrestlers, what's referred to as freestyle wrestling, is a close approximation in English. So, again, we see the identity being sort of conveniently hidden, but with this particular work, it's also a method for commenting on the last 100 years at least of this sort of not so gay friendly history, shall we say. But it's also almost like a bit of a reverie, right? There is no descript location that the individual is standing in. The name of the individual is not provided by the artist, whether it's himself or whether it's another model. But it's in a sense like he's sort of, as we might say now, living his gay fantasy. In this work here, we kind of see this compositional similarity running through a group of these. We have another Chinese artist whose name is Shen Wei. He has a really beautiful group of photographs. This happens to be called Self-Portrait, or titled Listen, from a series called I Miss You Already. So he positions himself in these sort of provocative, sometimes not super explicit, but provocative ways in which he's conveying this sense of longing to potentially a deep-hearted lover. So here his body is partially covered by this scraggly shrubbery on the right as he looks toward the camera. But within this body of work, you would see that he sort of positions himself in many various ways. However, this I think is a great transition into sort of the final section of the presentation with this scraggly bush. We also get some scraggly beards here with this lithograph from Philip Evergood. This is really interesting. It's called The Return, and the subject matter is basically the reconciliation of the prodigal son, which is conveyed in Luke 15:11 through 32, in which Evergood basically encourages, tolerance and acceptance of both the Christian church and society at large. In that the story sort of tells of a loving embrace between father and son when they're reunited. But the entwined, nature of these figures, their hands, their beards, the way they're looking at each other, this gentle act of caressing creates an atmosphere sort of nuance, suggests an appreciation at the very least for male closeness, and certainly throughout, despite some of the condemnation for homosexuality in the history of the Christian church, there is at the same time, a number of instances historically where eyes have turned the other way, shall we say. Then we have here a Tom of Finland, which I think needs somewhat or very little description. His work is very much known as a huge point in gay male erotica that has led to and brought about this sort of leather and even fetish daddy culture that exists, today. So this piece in particular was from 1977. And here there's this moment of tension between the two men in the foreground, not so dissimilar from the positioning of these two figures here, with their faces right next to one another, almost as if they're moving in for a kiss, but not quite. So some might balk at this comparison, but I certainly think that there's a similarity there. The implications of the baton, the nightstick, and the placement of the character's hands, leaves nothing to the imagination of what's going on here. Again, especially with Tom of Finland's work, there are many images that are substantially more explicit than this. It's essentially erotica. And we, the viewer, are, as we look upon this image in many ways, what we're assumed to have in common, or what the sort of vantage point that we're assumed to have is similar or in common with the man who's standing in the background, gazing upon it and sort of grabbing himself and enjoying it. So this sort of sexual tension where there's this almost embrace or almost kiss is also something that goes back in the history of Western art. So we have here an engraving called Jupiter Embracing Cupid, and it's actually just an engraving that's created after Raphael's fresco in the Chigi Gallery of the Villa Farnesina in Rome. I couldn't really find a great image of Raphael's version, but you can imagine it being in color and physically located on this spandrel between two arches within the architecture within the building. So here what we have is Jupiter, the Roman god on the right, who is also symbolized by this massive bird. They're actually one and the same, like he is the bird is him. Sometimes you only see the bird, sometimes you only see the man, but in this case we get both. And then we have Cupid, of course, the young god of love who has the bow and arrow there, who is about to be kissed by Jupiter. And this is part of classical mythology. So Jupiter is known to have had these homosexual relationships as well as a number of heterosexual relationships. So using contemporary terminology, we might refer to this mythical individual as bisexual. But nevertheless, it tends to generally be the lovers tend to be younger gods. So Cupid is one of them. Sometimes it's also represented as Ganymede, which in astronomy, interestingly, is actually one of the moons that orbits Jupiter. So that brings us to this piece by Felix Deon, who is also a Mexican artist. And here we have love triumphant, or the god of love. So this is another version of Cupid that we see here. And it's really quite a fascinating, this artist's work is quite fascinating. So this was created in 2020 or so, just about a year ago. And this particular Cupid is not, the traditional depiction. Here we have a transgendered Cupid, and it seems like it's a bit hard to see in this slide now that I'm looking closer at it, but the artist has very purposefully conveyed the sort of marks or scars that result from top surgery, from having an individual's breasts removed. So this is all an attempt to increase representation of otherwise marginalized individuals in fine art. This artist often depicts gay, lesbian, transgender, intersex persons in his work. In particular, the style is inspired by what he calls Edwardian, or sort of essentially Victorian designs, in this sense a little cartouche, meaning just a little kind of decorative container for an image like this. So on first glance, it looks as if this could be something much older than it actually is, and that's on purpose, because his attempt or his goal is to sort of reinsert individuals into history, in a sense, in a way that they were left out before. That brings us to this work by Papocolo called Trans Culture, or sorry, it's called Photogenics Color Poems, but here you see in block letters sort of written upon this trans culture. And essentially in this work, Colo comments on the association of external characteristics like facial expressions with internal qualities such as charisma. So therefore he's likening the relationship, that relationship between the two to discrepancies of visual dialogue. And basically what I mean by that is that he's commenting on aligning the inner self and the outer self through this work here, and advocating in 1979 when this work was created for trans rights and for the ability for all of us to live as our authentic selves. And of course, in the 1970s, there's this ongoing movement that resulted in many of the rights that the LGBT community do have today. Of course, it's an ongoing fight. But in 1973, not specifically applicable to the trans community, but within this context, the American Psychological Association did change the definition of homosexuality from a condition or a malady or a sickness to something that was, for lack of a better way of putting it, normal. They conveyed it in a number of sentences and paragraphs, but essentially they said that if it's something that's not bothering the individual, then they are a fully functional member of society and should be treated as such, which was a huge change from the early 20th century when Jack Pearson was younger, at which time gay men were often arrested for sexual encounters when the police maybe caught them in their automobiles and things like that. There were anti-sodomy laws, which in Michigan, by the way, despite the APA's ruling, were not fully revoked until 2003, which is shockingly recent. On all of this topic of rights and trans culture, this slide depicts artist, his name is Passos, goes by a single name, and goes by either, I believe, he, him, or they, them pronouns. But this artist is Canadian, and here they're interacting physically in a very dramatic way with this massive wet block of clay. So this is a recorded performance with sounds that would be played around you. So it's something that you would either have to experience live or see through, unfortunately, just photographs like this, which doesn't quite capture everything. But this brings us back to the topic of the fight, or la lutte here. But it's a really incredibly contemporary version of that. So this was actually already about 10 years ago, 2012, that this was created. But we have an openly transgender individual, and as opposed to fighting with another human, is fighting with the artistic material or traditional artistic materials such as clay themselves. So there's a bit of a rejection going on here of the history of the traditionalism sometimes of the fine art world. But the title indicates, becoming an image. It's also about leaving one's mark on the world. And literally he's doing that, or they're doing that through these punches and kicks into this material, which although wet at one point, after given enough time, will harden into something that's much more difficult to change. And here, I believe this is my second to last slide. I have a photograph by George Platt-Lyons, who was an openly gay artist in the earlier part of the 20th century. What you're seeing is essentially two men acting out this sort of performance that's called Orpheus, who was a legendary poet, musician, prophet in ancient Greece. So we have sort of a number of connections here, both to the ancient world, but also to Apollo's work here with this reflection of the inside and the outside with these props, especially those placed over the face. This slide is a work by Diane Arbus, who is, this is not in the FIA exhibition, but it is another female artist here in the presentation. It's actually in the collection where I'm at in Toronto in the Art Gallery of Ontario, but the artist herself was American. She passed away in 1971, and there was recently an exhibition at the AGO here of her work, and by and large, her oeuvre is very representative of marginalized, disenfranchised peoples. And it's interesting, I think, and I wanted to bring it in because there are parallels with Pearson's collection, with what he collected and the sort of content, the subject matter that Arbus found interesting. Within Pearson's collection, of course, within the exhibition, you'll see representations of gay identity, gay bodies, and also struggles related to the AIDS pandemic. But what you're not seeing on view in the exhibition, because it's something that goes farther beyond that, is that Pearson also collected works by, for example, Cuban artists and other artists of the Latin world, for example, who maybe didn't receive as much attention by the white American art world as others, but that he still felt were quality works, and and that he related to through this idea of not being granted this highest sort of equal status in society. And here within, as a gay man, I should say, and here within Diane Arbus's photo, we see three young men who are preparing for what we would call a drag show. So they're getting ready, in the mirror, and you kind of see one of the lights on the wall here. It's interesting that she titled the work Three Female Impersonators as opposed to drag queens, and that was a recurring theme throughout the images that she took of drag queens, and they were often in less than ideal surroundings, maybe in small dirty apartments or things like that, just in context, in conveying sort of the struggle that these individuals had to really be themselves, even in a place like New York City, and sort of make it financially and all those things, which actually rings true today, especially on the financial front, I think, for many who are in the performing and visual arts. But Arbus also photographed people, let's say, at nudist camps, or she photographed people who had physical disabilities, or anything that was sort of considered on the periphery of the so-called normal world. So her work is really interesting in that way here. So this is the final slide that I have for you as far as images within this final section relating to really what we might call gender bending, or the sort of gender neutral individuals, and there are four of them here, and I really thought it was just convenient that in placing them this way, they end up looking at one another. But at first glance, all four of them have these masculine external features. But it's interesting to note that on the left, what we're looking at is the cover of a book by André Tellier, who was a French artist who was born in 1902, and then he kind of falls out of the historical record. But this book was called Twilight Men, and it's a very rare publication of an early narrative about a homosexual couple. And unfortunately, it doesn't have a positive ending. You can see it was published in 1931. One of the only reasons it could be published is that it had not a positive ending. The main character, it sort of falls into this stereotype of the degenerate homosexual, right? As someone who had a mental instability, which, as I said, prior to the 1970s, was certainly the common mode of thinking. And this was 1931, so it was 4 decades at least before that. You have here in this depiction visually that the main character and his lover, and they're conveyed, as if they have these feminine facial features, in the sense that there's almost like this lipstick that's been applied, as well as exaggerated eyelashes, despite having a man's haircut. So there really is, even though it might not be so apparent to us today, there really is a negative connotation associated with this. And the same thing could be said about the work on the right by Hannah Gluckstein, who went by simply Gluck throughout their life and went by they, them pronouns, which is something that is quite substantial given how much before our time they were living. So this work is called Medallion. It's a self-portrait with their lover, Nesta Obermer. So essentially we have a lesbian couple here who is masculine, or at least gender neutral presenting. This happens to be in a private collection, but it's interestingly a very similar year of creation, 1936 versus 1931. So we see, I think with these two, to sort of round out this conversation, hopefully, in taking a look at some of the more contemporary works in this presentation, as well as some of the more historical works, either in the early part of the 20th century or farther back in art history, how far I think the LGBT community has come, how far society has come, not only through in terms of rights, but also what is able to be depicted in the visual arts through either more covert or overt ways. And so topics, have become less censored, and there's so much of an increasing freedom for gay artists to have the comfort to express themselves with their body in a way that isn't necessarily maybe held back or had to be put through the filter of these historical and deep-seated artistic practices. If you're interested in reading any more about this material on your own, these are a number of books that I consulted and continue to have by my side here. The one that's called Creating a Place for Ourselves that you see in the lower left in chapter 10 specifically details it has an interview with Jack B. Pearson. So the author of that section, I think it's Thomas Ruskin, interviewed him, published some of the information about his early life, of what it was like being a gay man in Flint, in a chapter called Cars and Bars, with the rise of the automobile and that sort of thing. So if you find that sort of local history really interesting, that's great for that. Across the back, you'll see essentially on the upper left a survey of art history, of gay art history specifically, the Male Nude by Taschen. All of those are photographs from the late 19th century to almost today. And then more recent publications are looking at men, which essentially is a broad scope of the male body in all of history, both homosexual and also not necessarily. And then art and queer culture, which takes a look predominantly at this period that we've been talking about, the 20th century. So those are some great reads. if you're all interesting. But I want to end my presentation by saying Happy Pride, everyone. And I hope it's been a great month for all of you. I know it has been for me. I'm so honored to be here again. And I want to thank Tracy and the rest of the FIA curatorial team for, believing in me and, collaborating on this project with the exhibition and the talk. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Eric, for such an interesting talk and so much to really ponder and think about. You'll be happy to know the people that are attending that is being recorded in case you want to go back and look at any or refer to any of the references that he showed or talked about. And it will be available on our website, flintarts.org, shortly in a week or so. So we don't have much time for questions, but I did want to get to a couple since it related to the exhibition and also what you've been referring to throughout your talk. One of them comes through from Hannah, and they say, first, thank you for introducing multiple tropes and defining the context of these art pieces from multiple time periods. I am also interested in the personal life / ephemera of the collector himself. You mentioned some of his personal life, but I was wondering if he left notes relating to his life and motivations for the pieces he collected, which themselves would be historic documents. Can you speak to how these influenced your curatorial choices? And as I said, we have about 10 minutes.
Sure, yeah, I'll try to answer it somewhat quickly here. Mm-hmm. But yes, so actually the primary task when I started working with the IFPDA position at the FIA was looking through the Jack B. Pearson donor files and all of the sort of archives ephemera, as you mentioned, that was left to the museum by him. And so there are a great deal of letters between Pearson and the curators at the FIA at the time. There's information about, sort of where he was living based on that and where he was traveling. So he did a lot of traveling with his partner, Robert Purcell, as I mentioned, even though he grew up in Flint and he worked for the auto industry, but then eventually moved for much of his life to New York, which I think was seen as a bit more of an accepting place, let's say, than Flint, Michigan in the mid-20th century. Although he always had a great affinity for his hometown, and hence he left the collection to the FIA. But some of the ephemera from the files are actually on view in the exhibition, specifically those relating to his concern over the AIDS crisis, being a gay man. And even though he was older at that time, and his partner had passed away, it was something I think that really hit home for him as not having had to maybe worry about when he was a younger man. As far as his collecting habits when he was younger, that I can't speak to as much at the moment off the top of my head. It's been a while since I've been in the files, but it's definitely there for someone who wants to focus on that more social history at some point.
Great, thank you, Eric. And another question comes from Gary. Can Eric speak to where gay art trends may be heading in the future?
Oh, that's really interesting. Well, I think that there's a greater freedom to explore, as I mentioned, the body. So we have this overt sort of expression that's being, I would say, mainstreamed in a sense, and in some ways, it does seem like that's actually slowed a little bit the rapid change in style, because there is oftentimes when we see a level of comfort in artists and in this established nature, there isn't necessarily as much of a need for or an encouragement for like massive innovation. But that's not to say that it's not happening. That's not to say that it shouldn't, or that I'm giving a negative response. But I do think it has sort of mellowed out a little bit. But I think it will be interesting to see in the future, especially as we're living through hopefully the end of the COVID-19 pandemic and other health crises that may impact marginalized communities such as gay men or queer people more generally. I think we would certainly see art that would, address those inequities and attempt to, call them out and look for change, just as we saw with the AIDS crisis. But I think the difference would be and is that others are recognizing it, and it's having a greater effect, put it that way. Yeah.
Well, thank you for revisiting a subject that you embarked upon 3 years ago. Actually, this exhibition was supposed to be on view last year, but because of the pandemic, it was pushed to this year. I appreciate you doing that, and in such a creative way of giving us more history behind a lot of these images. What are you working on right now in your doctoral studies?
So I'm working toward taking my comprehensive exams, which for those of you who are familiar with the format of that, it's just essentially a bunch of writing about your topic. But my topic is essentially museums and the design of museums and how they've changed from, let's say, the late 19th century to now, specifically as related to health concerns, which I think has been under discussed, but also as related to this topic, to sexuality. And that might seem really random, but if you look at the literature from that time, oftentimes sexual deviancy or quote unquote abnormalcy was categorized as something that's amoral and therefore unhealthy. So how those conversations affected arts and cultural organizations like museums is something that I'm really interested in, and working to sort of flesh out.
Well, we can't wait to see what you do. I knew as an intern, you're one of the best ones we've ever had, and I know that you're only going to just be art history rock star. So we thank you very much for being with us and coming back to do this. I think I'm going to end with this last question. So Jenny wants to know which of the pieces in the exhibition spoke to you the most.
Wow, I've had the question of which one is my favorite, but spoke to me the most. And that's different, I would say, though. The ones that actually what I think spoke to me the most are not any of the works, and maybe that sounds terrible, but not any of the works that are actually on the wall. But if you're able to visit the exhibit and see the ephemera case, the publications, the pamphlets of the that were published in the late 1980s, by Gay Men's Health Association, asking questions like, I'm HIV positive, what do I do now? And as someone who was born in 1993 and lived his life as an open gay man sort of after the height of that pandemic, it's a very different reality. And we've had, developments in the medical field like retrovirals and medications like PrEP that prevent you from contracting the virus to begin with. And so looking at that ephemera and seeing firsthand and holding that material from that time, and seeing just the great sort of horror that was going on was really, really eye-opening for me, and in a very direct way. So I'm appreciative for that experience, and that's really what moved me the most. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And unfortunately, we're out of time, but I'd like to invite everyone to come and see the exhibition before it ends. Again, it closes July 11th. Please come and see it. We're free every Saturday as part of Huntington Bank Free Saturdays, and we would love to see you at the museum. And as of right now, Michigan has lifted all the restrictions, so you can come and just enjoy art. So again, thank you, Eric. Thank you, everyone, for attending this virtual talk by Eric Birkle. Have a great evening and good night.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.